But as I say, it gets you into the idea of it being a howl in itself for you to say, I am a Dadaist. It sounds nonsensical, it's universal. And the Romanian Dadaist Tristan Tzara advised in a 1918 manifesto, again, that we shouldn't overthink Dada. He said, don't waste your time on a word that means nothing. So again, we're not to try and pin it down. It is a mark of abstraction, he said, to sow demoralization everywhere, to throw heaven's hand into hell. Everything you look at is false. This is their philosophical position. And he continued in the 1918 manifesto, ideal, 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 knowledge, 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 boom, 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 boom. So we have the idea of the pistols coming out. Ideal is to be destroyed, knowledge is to be fractured, and the Dada cry is the boom, boom of the guns. Again, it is the idea of an attack on you so that you're woken up. And this is something that actually sounds perhaps quite ominous and threatening, but of course much of it was staged in cabarets. Now you're doing sort of Paris on the left bank and the idea of sort of Montmartre and various spaces around Paris, but the notion of a cabaret was what these avant-garde groups, the Dadaists first, decided was the perfect space for their art, because it brought many different disciplines together. So you could have people reciting poetry, you could have people reading text, people making proclamations, all usually nonsensical, often using almost a kind of a gibberish, a nonsensical or a fake language in their sense. They had performance, they had music, a theatre, sound. So people came and were surrounded by art and immersed into a whole experience. And this was the idea of people in Zurich, as I say. So if you think of Dada spreading across the map of Europe, Hugo Ball, a poet, a writer, a theatre director, Emmy Hennings, who later married Ball, so you have men and women coming together, set up the Cabaret Voltaire, in homage to Voltaire, but as I say, in a cabaret-like space, where Hugo Ball, when he would read poetry, would explain that a line of poetry is a chance to get rid of all the filth that clings to this accursed language. So again, it was about rebirthing the language in that sense. Tristan Tzara, the poet, performed there. Hans Arp, a painter, or Jean Arp, as we know, as he's also referred to, presented their artwork there. And the motif, in terms of trying to produce artworks which embrace this philosophy, which exemplify this philosophy, often, as I say, was collage. So with Hans Arp, we have him experimenting with words. He would take a newspaper with his eyes closed, rip it, threw words down, and as the words fell, this would create a line of chance poetry. It's a bit like those magnets you can buy for your fridge now to create these poetry. He did the same thing with colours, scraps of cloth, to try and create compositions where he himself wasn't burdened by expectations, by taste, by technique. And it opened it up in that sense. So as I say, there was an element of chance, even in a work like Earth Forms of 1917. And when his wife, Sophie DADA Arp, whom he married in 1922, also produced very interesting sculptures, which you can see here, which sort of presaged later women's surrealist fascination with the domestic art object in particular. She's someone who taught embroidery at the School of Applied Arts in Zurich in 1916 through to 1929. And she said that she was an artist by night, or a Dadaist by night. And again, what she did was find found objects from her work as a seamstress and a tutor. And she produced sculptural portraits, which use polychrome wood, glass beads, wire, things that normally would be in your toolkit as a seamstress, let's say. Banal, everyday objects, not the oil paint, not the canvas we might expect. And at the same time, obviously, in creating these heads, like this Dada head here, she referred to non-Western art as perhaps the direction we need to be looking, to oceanic masks, as well as to fashion and consumerism, because it also looks like a hat maker's stand. So sort of the tools fashioned and refashioned. So the found object, and often using things that we've normally bin and deemed to be worthless, are imbued with a new value as a way of critiquing our system of values. I mentioned the fact that they would have cabarets. The other thing they had was art fairs. So we're used to art fairs at this stage. Many of us, the biennales, and we think about the art fair. What the Dada and Surrealists did was stage their own art fairs. their own exhibitions. They curated themselves, again as a way, of course, of mocking the system that creates or fashions art as merchandise. And here you have the first International Dada Fair in Berlin in 1920. You have George Grosz standing up, wearing a bowler hat. And Dada moved from Zurich to Berlin around this time, 1918, 1919. It was led there by George Grosz, Otto Dix, Royal Haussmann, Hannah Hoch, John Hartfield, people you might have heard of. They again produced journals as well as exhibitions, catalogues, which mocked the idea that you could teach through word and image, because their journals were titled things like The Dada, Deadly Earnest, Rose-Coloured Spectacles of a Lavatory, Every Man is His Own Football. So absurd titles which immediately made you on edge as a spectator. And of course, very famously in performances at the Dada Fair and at Dada exhibitions, people like George Grosz would pretend to relieve himself against a canvas, shouting out loud, because it was all performative, saying, "Art is shit." So the first International Dada Fair took place in Berlin, the summer of 1920. As I said, you have George Grosz standing up there. And you also have up on the ceiling, and the idea was to create a very collage-like environment, something very cluttered, very chaotic, very intrusive. It's not the lovely sort of academy space. It's not a nice white cube. There's nothing calm about it. But as George Grosz emphasized, they wanted to create a mood of discontent, of cynicism, but also of scandal and fun. And that's how they wooed in younger generations in particular, who flocked to these exhibitions, curious to find out what was going on, and as a result, finding political fermentation, if you like, in the space. This in the ceiling again, so you didn't know where to look with the Dada or later Surrealist exhibition, which is something that I'm always fascinated by. But there was the idea that it was performative, it was theatrical, something might pounce at you. And here we have hanging from the ceiling a Prussian Archangel by Hartfield and Rudolf Schlichter, which was a pig-faced dummy. You can just about see hanging from the ceiling, and again he's wearing military uniform. That this is a big puppet, effectively. It's the kind of thing that has been restaged perhaps more in contemporary art. But he's also wrapped in a poster which read, "I came from heaven on high," which is a reference to the German Christmas carol. And he had a sign dangling below him, which again attacked the military through art, in saying, in order to understand this work of art completely, one should drill daily for 12 hours. So it was using a lot of rhetoric of the military machine in their artworks, of course, to, as I say, create a subversive criticism. It was also a clever way of doing it, if you like, a kind of resistance, a clandestine resistance, because it was all encoded. The police actually came and took this down. The two artists were not ultimately prosecuted, but because it wasn't an overt act of propaganda, which would have gone against what the Dadists were about, it was about re-educating people through art, they got away with these statements, these political, if you like, assaults. Also, I mentioned this is where the idea of the body and the body politic come into play, because not only were they mocking the military pig, but they were also often using the idea of sexual violence as a code for what was going on in society, the attack of bodies in general, the kind of dehumanization of society. And so we have figures like George Grosz. Here, you saw him in his bowler cap, which is usually his way of mocking the bourgeois man. Here in Sex, Murder on Ackerstrasse of 1916, he depicts a Jack the Ripper-like character engrossed in the mutilation of a nameless female victim. This is parodying the sensationalism of tabloid newspapers at the time, and the fact perhaps that they were focused on the wrong type of butchery that was going on, if you think about what was happening in the war versus what is happening in the street. But of course, part of it also is about the sheer banality of evil, the sheer banality of terror and violence at the time. Because you have, again, in this figure, not only a decapitated female on this sort of, on the bed, the bowler hat thrown on the floor, her shoes on the floor, but you also have over on the left-hand side beside a gramophone, thank you, which was the sort of the idea, allusion to a nice romantic evening. The bottle of wine is there to the far right, but also a little horseshoe, lucky in love. And she was obviously anything but lucky in love. So you decode the image, thinking about what is acceptable and what symbolism you recognize. the trappings of the romantic evening, and then the fact that he is just busy washing his bloodstained hands. And this is just another corpse for a line of corpse. This was meant to appall people. This was meant to alarm people. The idea of the mutilation of bodies, the nameless victim, etc. And of course, we know that George Grosz himself experienced the front too. So he has the idea of trying to present the guilty killer, but in the man of the street, who ultimately is responsible for whom he votes for and the machines that he participates in. There was an element, I think the Berlin group were emphatically obsessed with sort of sexual violence in this sense. But of course, Dadists that you're probably more familiar with might include people like Marcel Duchamp, the chess player, as I think of him usually, the man who would set up works of art again for a way to try and outwit you to a certain extent. And in New York, Picabia, who we saw, and Marcel Duchamp fled the war and fled having to enlist in the war and produced ready-made art objects, again as a way of attacking the art market and the idea of art having inherent value. Duchamp said in 1913, when he first created what he called a ready-made, was that these are works of art that are not art. So it's a bit like the joke about contemporary art, where now people say, well, that's not art, or I can do it, or anything might be a work of art. Of course, his point was that it was about how we value art. And his emphasis was on what he called not beauty in some sublime way, but a beauty of indifference. So how did he do it? Well, he produced indifferent objects like a bicycle wheel attached to a stool so that it could spin. He produced in advance of a broken arm, where, as you can see here, which is nothing more than a snow shovel. The title makes you think differently. The title makes you think about the act, or the fact that something can be removed from a traditional functional role and restaged as art, repurposed. And therefore the language, the sort of relationship between artwork and language is mocked. And of course the most famous is not a urinal, but a fountain. Again, by inverting something that's mass-produced, that's typical of a prison. These were literally the mass-produced, the lowest of the low when it came to urinal. And it wasn't just, as I say, putting it on a pedestal literally as art, dating it, as all connoisseurs would expect, signing it Ormot, not Marcel Duchamp, but it was even a reference to the fact that you could go and buy one of your own through J.L. Mott's Plumbing Fixtures Catalogue, which was abound. These ideas that there were huge displays of wonderful bathrooms and toilets and urinals that one can buy. So they used the mass catalogue object. Of course, he signed it Ormot, which referred, as I said, to this, to Mott Plumbing. But phonetically also Armut, in terms of the German for poverty, is 1917. So we're thinking about, again, the end of the war and the idea that there was great human poverty in terms of humanity in general. It's still a urinal shaped as a fountain, so we had the body encoded in it, the sexual body, the sexual organ in that sense. And this is where the political and the sexual start to seep into each other, something that's literally the body, the explicit sexual body, but the body politic because it's commenting back on what's going on in society. And this is where Marcel Duchamp's alter ego is crucial to understanding his art, because as Duchamp, his alter ego was Rose, a female alter ego. Rose, which of course you say Rose is like Eros, and her name was Rose c'est la vie, or Eros c'est la vie. So eroticism and Eros, the life and sex drive, was his doppelganger. And this is Marcel, with the hands of Germaine Everling, the partner of Picabia, be photographed by Man Ray. So it's a collective artwork, really, in that sense. And it is where all these men are mocking masculinity in the interwar period, taking on the idea of the flapper, the garçon, the female virago, if you like, in the 20s, identifying with her, not the men who they were fighting against in their art. And as I say, saying life is Eros, and Eros, that's life. He said in an interview with Richard Hamilton, and that's the quote there on BBC in 1959, eroticism is close to life, which we can't disagree with. It's closer to life than philosophy or anything like it. It's an animal thing that has many facets and is pleasing to use, as you would use a tube of paint. So we also have a sort of comical idea of him using eroticism like a tube of paint. He's somebody who's saying the thing about eroticism or erotic art or seeing a body in an artwork is you yourself have a body when you're viewing it. And this is again the idea of art as something that's about embodiment. You are a body experiencing the work of art, your body speaks to its body, or how you respond to something, whether it's beautiful, seductive, appalling, violent, confusing, in the case of something more queer in this image, is again a sort of universal language which breaks down traditional boundaries and makes us look and think differently. Now, Surrealism took this further. Tristan and Sophie brought a lot of Dada ideas. Marcel Duchamp was back and forth between New York and Paris. Man Ray moves from New York to Paris, all around 1921. And this is when Paris becomes the mecca of what the avant-garde is about. It attracts all these international thinkers and artists and writers, and they try together to form perhaps a more coherent movement called Surrealism, which was going to take the real and not create something nightmare. So it's not a kind of heightened reality, but the surreal was finding this idea of something being bizarre, uncanny, strange in the real. So they want us to look at the real differently. It's a bit like a pair of glasses or something. And often we talk about, again, Surrealism as a postgraduate Dada, a housebroken Dada. It wasn't as anarchic or as nihilistic as Dada. It wasn't literally about destroying the artwork, but it was about creating experiences through art, which, as I say, would affect you in that sense. And they wanted you to discover a different Paris. Not the Paris of the Grand Boulevard, the Haussmann, the Quelle Boîte, the kind of Monet's Paris that we like and love. There's no parapluie in their paintings. If there is, it's going to be a sort of a symbol of the phallus or something Freudian. What they wanted you to turn to were the billboards, the shop windows, the Baby Cadam soap ads, which you can see here, the new Mazda light bulb, the Revue Nègre with Josephine Baker, jazz, things that were bringing in a whole new cultural element to Paris, and the flea market. And if you wanted to find an interesting object, you were to go shopping in your flea market in this sense, where of course people like André Breton, Giacometti regularly did. And this was the idea that the artist and the type of person we need to be was the Peasant de Paris, the Paris peasant. The idea that you were a night walker, a street walker, an outsider. And as Louis Aragon's novel, Paris Peasant, which was published there by Gallimard in 1926, as it indicated, this was the idea that you could have a surrealist experience just by walking down the street, just by turning down a dark corridor, just by following a stranger, just by being open to a different experience. And this was before the Situations had these ideas. And Aragon's Le Paysan de Paris is a book that, again, a philosopher, Walter Benjamin, would say in a letter to another grand philosopher, Theodore Adorno, in 1935, that this was such an exciting book, The Paysan de Paris. If you haven't read it, you'll go out and do it this weekend. That when he would read it in bed, he could only read a few pages because his heartbeat would start pounding with excitement. This wasn't sexual excitement just, but it was the idea in his own words that there was a radical inventiveness and intensity about this idea that art and writing could do something. Walter Benjamin is the person who famously committed suicide on the border, the Spanish border, as the Nazis were getting closer to him. But he was excited by the idea, again, of it as a political weapon. Nadja, André Breton's Nadja, the same thing, 1928, is a novel set in the streets of Paris, where the protagonist is Paris, really, but embodied in the figure of this girl called Nadja, who we only know by her first name, which is a Russian name, which means the beginning, she says. She has dark eyes, she barely touches the floor. And the story again begins as a point of departure at the Hôtel des Grands Hommes. And we have the idea that he walks through the streets of Paris, but it's a different Paris. It is the Paris, as I say, of the flea markets, of hotels that are called Sphinx Hotel, and of cafes and of the poor and the bedraggled. It is not a glamorous Paris, but this is the Paris he wants you all to discover. And by reading a book, you're entering into surrealist shoes. The philosophy of surrealism then, as again André Breton said, was to transform the world, à la Marx, to change life, like the poet Rimbaud said. And these two words for the surrealists had to be brought together. There was a Marxism and there was a Rimbaud, a poetry, a politics and a poetry that had to be brought together. And always, even in the midst of World War II, when he was living in the United States in exile, Breton said, again, the power of surrealism, building on the power of Dada, was to inflame life, inflame life with passion, with desire, reawaken the senses, because the mind had only led to man's destruction of man. So if Dada began as sort of absurd and anarchic, as I say, and grew out of the war and the Russian Revolution and the death of Lenin, we find with the surrealism something more utopian, aspirational, and an idea that you could attack family, country, or religion. You could laugh like savages. These are quotes from André Breton. And the weapon often was sexual cynicism, sexual explicitness, but it was specifically, as I say, to enrager the bourgeoisie, to enrager the audiences, so that they would experience life differently. And this is where a sense of a philosophy of the boudoir, this is where it comes into play, because for the surrealists in their first manifesto, they said the Marquis de Sade is surrealist. He is surrealist in sadism. It is something extreme, but as in his 1795 novel, Philosophy of the Boudoir, where we have the re-education, if you want to put it that way, of the young Eugénie, we have again the idea that through example, through reading, through the absurd, because the writings of the Marquis de Sade are fabulously absurd, not just in their detail and in their orgies, which are so impossible, but also in their absurd use, if you like, of revolutionary tracks. But we had the idea that, as I say, you could re-educate through the artwork. So they seized the Marquis de Sade as their icon, their sort of philosopher, or philosophe par excellence for their movement. And Paul Eluard would say that in those he thanked for his own career, he includes Lautréamont, André Breton, who brought him into surrealism, but of course the Marquis de Sade. We find that in the Bureau of Research that the surrealists set up in 1924 to 25, they encouraged people to come, discuss, and read the Marquis de Sade. We find that they sent out flyers saying, if you love love, you will love surrealism. And people would walk the streets of Paris, pick up something, and wonder what it was about. But of course, their idea of love was something more extreme. It was usually amour fou. It was usually something very licentious, very libertine. It certainly wasn't, as I say, procreative love. It wasn't family love. It wasn't the love of God, of saint, of father, or state. It was a radically different sense of love. But they harnessed that word love for their own radical agendas. And they produced works like Liberty or Love, again, a rally cry in a novel by Robert Desnos of 1927, where in this plot we have a young woman who ends up naked running through the streets of Paris, Louise Lam, and where you have things like the baby Cadam soap and the Bibendum big doll, as I say, running through the streets after her. So it's absurd, and she ends up in the Bois de Boulogne, of course, having her sexual delight out there. And desire was everywhere. And this is why, too, we have it in everything you sit on and everything you touch, and why they're so fascinated by objects and domestic objects, furniture, whether it was Salvador Dali's Mae West lip sofa, where you would sit on the lips of Mae West, where he produced half a dozen of these sofas. This one with Edward James, the British collector, which is now in the V&A collection, or Merd Oppenheim's, the Swiss woman surrealist, Object or Breakfast in Fur of 1936, which of course is in the MoMA collection and was bought in 1936. A regular, everyday cup, saucer and spoon, which you could buy in the department store, was her point, covered in Giselle fur, so that it turned into this bestial, sexually suggestive object, which you might delight in or fear. You might be repulsed by or attracted or seduced by.